不下海风中烟波，虚化了无关左右。你想写一句伤得谁有时紧紧手抱的理由，可惜也收到不幸美好美意的背后。
The richest man in the city was on his knees, sobbing in a hospital bathroom because his 3-year-old son wouldn't stop screaming. Nobody knew. Outside that locked door, Richard Blake's lawyers were handling million-dollar deals on their phones. His assistants were rescheduling meetings with senators and tech giants. His security team stood like statues in their black suits. But inside that white-tiled room, Richard had his hands pressed against his ears, tears streaming down his face because for 72 hours straight his little boy had been crying, and nothing, not the best doctors, not the most expensive toys, not even his own desperate hugs, could make it stop. The sound was breaking him, high-pitched wails that seemed to come from somewhere so deep inside his son that Richard wondered if the boy was in pain no machine could measure. Samuel was deaf, born that way. And ever since they'd brought him home from his latest doctor's appointment 3 days ago, the child had been inconsolable. The specialists said sometimes deaf children cried like this because they couldn't process their own fear, couldn't hear their parents' soothing voices, couldn't understand why the world felt so wrong. Hey friends, thank you so much for stopping by. Don't forget to comment where you are watching from. Someone close to you might be watching too. Like, share, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you never miss a story. Make sure to watch till the very end, because the final twist is something you definitely don't want to miss. So, let's continue. Richard had fired 2 nannies already. Not because they'd done anything terrible, but because watching them fail to comfort his son made him feel even more helpless. His wife, Victoria, had locked herself in their bedroom that morning. Not sleeping. Just sitting by the window, staring at nothing. Her eyes had that hollow look rich people get when they realize their money means absolutely nothing. And it didn't. Richard had spent $4 million in the past year alone trying to help Samuel. Surgeries that might restore partial hearing, the doctors said no, too risky, might make things worse. Experimental treatments in Switzerland, nothing changed. The finest child psychologists in the country, they took notes, nodded sympathetically, and accomplished exactly 0. Every expert had the same maddening advice. Give it time, be patient, he'll adjust. But Samuel wasn't adjusting. He was disappearing into his own world of silence and fear, and his only way to communicate that terror was to cry until his voice went hoarse, then cry some more. Richard splashed cold water on his face. His reflection in the mirror looked 20 years older than it had last week. His phone buzzed. Another text from his assistant. Board meeting in 40 minutes. They need you there. He typed back, cancel it. Sir, this is the merger we've been working toward for 6 months. I said, cancel it. Richard walked back into the hospital room where Samuel sat in Victoria's lap, his small face red and wet, his mouth open in another silent scream that wasn't silent at all. The boy's hands were balled into tiny fists, hitting his own chest like he was trying to break through to something inside himself. We can sedate him again, the doctor offered quietly. Young woman, competent eyes, clearly exhausted from her own sleepless nights dealing with this case. Just for a few hours, let him rest. No. Victoria's voice was sharp. I won't drug my baby into silence. That's not solving anything. Mrs. Blake, I understand, but you don't understand anything. Victoria stood up, holding Samuel against her shoulder. The boy's crying intensified. If you understood, you'd fix this. That's what we pay you for. That's what everyone keeps promising. But nobody can do anything except suggest we drug him or wait it out or accept it. Well, I don't accept it. She walked out of the room, Samuel still wailing, her expensive heels clicking down the corridor. Richard started to follow, then stopped. Where would he go? Home, where every room echoed with his son's pain. The office, where people depended on him to make decisions when he couldn't even decide how to help his own child. The doctor touched his arm. Mr. Blake, There's a family in the waiting room. They've been here for 3 hours. They say they can help. Richard's jaw tightened. Another miracle cure? Some herbal remedy? Crystal healing? No, sir, it's a boy, maybe 12 years old. He says he knows why Samuel is crying. A child? Richard almost laughed, but nothing felt funny anymore. You're telling me a random kid claims he can solve what dozens of specialists can't? I'm telling you he's been sitting out there since 6 this morning and he won't leave. His grandmother is with him. They're poor, sir. I don't think they're here to scam you. I think... She paused. I think maybe you should just meet them. Richard didn't believe in miracles. He believed in science, data, results that could be measured and repeated. But he also believed that when you're drowning, you don't question the hand reaching down to pull you up, you just grab it. 5 minutes, he said, that's all I'm giving them. The boy was wearing a jacket 2 sizes too big and shoes that had been repaired so many times the original material was barely visible. He sat perfectly still in the plastic chair, his hands folded in his lap, while his grandmother knitted something beside him. She was old, her face creased like a map of hard years, but her eyes were sharp and kind. When Richard approached, the boy stood immediately. He bowed his head slightly, not in a servile way, but with genuine respect. Mr. Blake, the boy said. His English had an accent that softened the edges of each word. My name is Wei, I can help your son. How did you even know I was here? Richard kept his voice neutral, but inside he was calculating, was this a setup? Some elaborate scheme? Everyone knows, Wei said simply. Your son has been crying for 3 days. The nurses talk, people hear things. We came because... He glanced at his grandmother, who nodded. Because I understand what he's feeling. You're deaf? No, sir. But I know what it's like when the world is too loud and you can't make anyone understand. I know what it's like when you're small and scared and nobody speaks your language. Richard studied the boy. Wei's eyes were old for his age, the kind of old that comes from seeing too much too young. What makes you think you can do anything doctors can't? Because doctors try to fix the body. I just want to talk to his heart. The words should have sounded ridiculous. Instead, they hit Richard like a punch to the chest. He'd been so focused on medical solutions, on treatments and therapies and procedures, that he'd forgotten his son wasn't a problem to be solved. He was a terrified child who needed to feel safe. All right, Richard said slowly. You have 5 minutes. But if you upset him more... I won't, Wei promised. Victoria didn't want to allow it. She stood in front of Samuel's room like a guard, her arms crossed, her face a mask of maternal fury. Absolutely not, I won't let some stranger... He's a child, Richard said. What harm can he do? The same harm every other person has done. Getting Samuel's hopes up, getting our hopes up, then failing. Her voice cracked. I can't take any more failures, Richard. I can't. Then we do nothing? We just let him cry until... Richard couldn't finish the sentence. Inside the room, Samuel had finally exhausted himself into a kind of half-sleep, still whimpering, his small body jerking with leftover sobs. He looked so tiny in that hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and screens that showed numbers nobody could interpret into comfort. Wei stepped forward. He didn't ask permission. He simply walked past Victoria, not rudely, just with the confidence of someone who knew his purpose, and into the room. His grandmother stayed behind, settling into a chair with her knitting, as if this was perfectly normal. Richard and Victoria rushed after Wei, but something stopped them at the doorway. Maybe it was the gentleness in the boy's movements. Maybe it was the fact that Samuel, sensing a new presence, had opened his eyes. Wei sat down on the floor beside the bed, not on a chair, not standing above the child, but down on the cold tiles, making himself smaller, less threatening. He reached into his too big jacket and pulled out something small. A wooden bird, carved by hand, simple but beautiful. He placed it on the floor where Samuel could see it. Then Wei started to cry, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears rolling down his face while he looked at the wooden bird. His shoulders shook slightly, his hands trembled, and Samuel stopped whimpering. The change was so sudden that Victoria gasped. Samuel sat up in bed, staring at Wei with wide, confused eyes. The boy on the floor was crying, and somehow that seemed to matter more to Samuel than anything else that had happened in 3 days. Wei didn't wipe his tears away. He let them fall while his hands moved in slow, deliberate gestures. Not sign language. Richard had learned enough ASL to know that. These were just movements, simple and clear. Wei pointed to his own chest, then to his eyes where tears fell, then to the wooden bird, then to Samuel. The message was clear. I'm sad too. I understand. You're not alone. Samuel climbed down from the bed. His legs were unsteady. He'd barely walked in days, but he moved toward Wei with determination. When he reached the boy on the floor, Samuel sat down beside him, not touching, just sitting close, looking at the wooden bird together. Wei picked it up and offered it to Samuel. The child took it with careful hands, turning it over, examining the carved feathers. Then Samuel did something he hadn't done in 72 hours. He smiled. Just a small smile, barely there. But it was real. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. Richard felt his legs go weak. Neither of them moved, terrified that any sound might break whatever spell Wei had cast. Wei's hands moved again. He pointed to the bird, then made a flying motion with his hands. His eyes were still wet, but now he was smiling too. He stood up slowly, encouraging Samuel to stand with him. Together they made the bird fly through the air, Wei guiding Samuel's hands, showing him how to dip and soar and glide. Samuel laughed. The sound was hoarse and small, but it was laughter, real joy breaking through all that pain and fear. Richard's vision blurred. He realized he was crying too, and he didn't care who saw. They moved to a private room, one without all the machines and medical equipment. Wei sat with Samuel for the next 2 hours, and Richard watched through the window like he was observing a miracle. Because that's what it felt like. Wei had brought other things in his jacket. A bag of smooth stones from the river, a piece of silk fabric that changed color when you moved it, a small notebook filled with simple drawings. Each object became a game, a shared language between the two boys. But it was more than just distraction. Wei seemed to know exactly when Samuel was getting overwhelmed. He'd slow down, sit quietly, let the silence stretch. He never pushed, never demanded, just offered friendship with no strings attached. Victoria stood beside Richard, her hand gripping his arm so tightly it hurt. "How is he doing this?" she whispered. "I don't know." Wei's grandmother appeared beside them. Her knitting needles clicked softly. "My grandson has a gift," she said. Her English was heavily accented but clear. "Not magic, just understanding. When Wei was small, we came to this country with nothing. His parents died in the crossing. He was 6 years old and didn't speak the language. For 1 year, he didn't talk to anyone. Not because he couldn't, because nobody listened." Richard turned to look at her. "How did he—" A teacher sat with him. Every day during lunch, she sat on the floor beside his desk and ate her sandwich in silence. Didn't force him to talk, didn't try to fix him, just showed him he wasn't alone. After 3 months, Wei spoke his first English word. "Thank you," he said to her. Just that, but it was enough. The old woman smiled. Wei remembers what it's like to feel invisible, so he sees children other people don't see. He understands their silence. "Why did you come here?" Victoria asked. "Why help us? You don't know us." The grandmother's needles paused. "Because when I heard about your son crying for 3 days, I heard my own grandson in that sound. And I thought maybe Wei could give back what was given to him. Kindness doesn't need a reason, Mrs. Blake. It just needs to be offered." Inside the room, Samuel had fallen asleep in Wei's lap. The wooden bird was clutched in his small hand. Wei sat very still, barely breathing, clearly afraid to wake him. His own eyes were drooping with exhaustion. It was past noon and he'd been up since before dawn. Richard opened the door quietly. "Wei," he whispered, "you can move. I'll take him." Wei shook his head. "He's comfortable," he whispered back. "I don't mind." You've done enough. More than enough. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to thank me, Mr. Blake. Way paused, choosing his words carefully. My grandmother says when you have nothing, you learn that people are worth more than things. Samuel doesn't need expensive toys or doctors. He needs to know someone understands him. That's all I did. I just understood. Richard knelt beside them. He looked at his son's peaceful face, the first real rest the boy had gotten in days. What do you want, Way? Money? I can pay you anything. I don't want money, sir. Then what? Way was quiet for a long time. Then he said, My grandmother is sick. The doctors say she needs an operation, but we don't have insurance. We've been saving, but... He stopped, his face flushing with embarrassment. I'm sorry. I didn't come here for that. I just wanted to help Samuel. How much is the operation? $30,000, maybe more. We have $3,000 saved. My grandmother knits blankets and sells them, and I work at a restaurant after school washing dishes, but it's not enough. It will never be enough. Way's voice dropped to almost nothing. She's all I have. If she dies... Richard stood up. His jaw was set, his eyes bright. She's not going to die. I'm going to make sure of that. And Way... He waited until the boy looked up at him. You didn't just help Samuel today. You taught me something I forgot. You reminded me what matters. The operation was scheduled for the following week. Richard didn't just pay for it. He called in favors, got the best surgical team in the country, made sure Way's grandmother had a private room with round-the-clock care. When Way protested that it was too much, Richard simply said, You gave me back my son. This doesn't come close to repaying that debt. But the story didn't end there. Samuel began to improve. Not overnight, healing never happens that fast. But Way visited 3 times a week after school, and each time he came, Samuel's world got a little brighter. They developed their own language, a mix of simple signs and shared understanding that didn't need words. Way taught Samuel that being deaf didn't mean being broken. He introduced Samuel to other deaf children, families in Way's neighborhood who didn't have money for fancy schools or therapies, but who had learned to thrive anyway. Samuel saw kids laughing, playing, living full lives despite their silence. And slowly, the fear that had consumed him began to fade. Victoria changed too. She started volunteering at the community center in Way's neighborhood, teaching art classes to children who'd never held a paintbrush before. She told Richard one night, I spent years surrounding Samuel with expensive things, thinking that would keep him safe. But Way's grandmother raised him with nothing, and he's the kindest, strongest person I've ever met. Maybe we had it backwards. Richard began to understand that being powerful didn't mean controlling everything. It meant knowing when to let go, when to accept help, when to admit you didn't have all the answers. But 6 months after that first meeting, something changed. Richard got the call at 2 a.m. Way's grandmother had collapsed. The operation had been successful, but complications had developed. An infection the doctors couldn't control. She was in the ICU, and they weren't sure she'd make it through the night. Richard and Victoria rushed to the hospital with Samuel. They found Way in the waiting room, his too big jacket wrapped around him like armor, his eyes red but dry. He'd cried himself out hours ago. She wants to see you, Way said to Richard. His voice was hollow. All of you? She asked. The old woman looked so small in that hospital bed, tubes and wires connecting her to machines that beeped urgently. But her eyes were still sharp when Richard, Victoria, and Samuel entered. She smiled at them, though it clearly hurt to do so. Way is alone now, she whispered. Her English was faltering, slipping back into her native language. Way translated quietly. When I'm gone, he has no one. The state will take him, put him in the system. I've seen what happens to children there. They disappear. Grandma, don't... Way's voice cracked. You're not dying. The doctors said... The doctors are kind, she interrupted gently. But I know. I feel it. She looked at Richard. You asked me once why I brought Way to help your son. I told you kindness needs no reason, but I lied. I had a reason. I was praying that if my grandson showed you his heart, you might see him as more than a poor boy from the wrong side of the city, that you might see him as I see him, as someone worth saving." Richard felt Victoria's hand grip his. He looked at Wei, who was staring at the floor, shame and grief warring on his young face. "What are you asking?" Richard said quietly. "Take care of him, please, not as charity, as family. He has so much to give, Mr. Blake. Don't let the world crush that out of him. Don't let him disappear." Victoria knelt beside the bed. "We would be honored," she said, and Richard heard the tears in her voice. "Wei saved our son. The least we can do is give him a home." Wei's head snapped up. "I don't want charity," he said fiercely. "I don't want you to take me because you feel guilty or because my grandmother asked. I can survive on my own. I've done it before." "I know you can survive," Richard said. He sat down so he was eye level with Wei. "But you shouldn't have to just survive. You should get to live. You should get to be a kid," and his voice softened. "Samuel needs you, not as a visitor, as a brother. We all need you, Wei, if you'll let us." Wei's tough facade cracked. Tears spilled down his face. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would you want me?" "Because you're extraordinary," Victoria said. "Because you have more courage and compassion in your little finger than most people have in their whole bodies. Because you made our family whole again, and we want to do the same for you." The old woman smiled. She reached out a trembling hand and touched Wei's face. "Be happy," she whispered in her own language. "That's all I ever wanted, for you to be happy and safe." She died 2 hours later, with Wei holding one hand and Richard holding the other. Peaceful, surrounded by people who loved her. The transition wasn't easy. Wei moved into the Blake house with a single backpack of belongings and a wall of defenses built from years of learning not to trust, not to hope for too much. He was polite but distant. He did his homework without being asked, kept his room spotless, barely ate at meals. "He thinks we're going to send him back," Victoria said one night after another silent dinner. "He's waiting for us to realize we made a mistake." Samuel understood what his parents didn't. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after Wei moved in, Samuel climbed into Wei's lap while Wei was pretending to read. The older boy stiffened, uncomfortable with the affection, but Samuel was persistent. He put his small hands on Wei's face, making him look down. Then Samuel signed something. Not perfect ASL, but close enough. The signs for brother and stay and love. Wei's defenses shattered. He hugged Samuel and cried like he hadn't let himself cry at his grandmother's funeral. Great, heaving sobs that seemed to come from the bottom of his soul. And Samuel just held on, patient and steady, giving back the comfort Wei had once given him. After that, things changed. Wei started to relax. He laughed at dinner. He taught Richard how to make his grandmother's dumpling recipe. He helped Victoria with her art classes. He played with Samuel for hours, building elaborate cities out of blocks and acting out complex stories with action figures. Richard watched his family grow. 2 sons now. One deaf, one an immigrant orphan. Both teaching him daily that strength comes in forms he'd never imagined, but the biggest change came a year later. Richard was at a charity gala, the kind of event he used to love. Powerful people making deals while pretending to care about causes. But tonight felt different. He was there to announce a new foundation, the Wei Foundation, dedicated to helping immigrant children and families access medical care, education, and support services. Wei was with him, uncomfortable in a borrowed suit, shifting from foot to foot on stage as Richard gave his speech. "A year ago," Richard told the crowd, "I was the richest man in this city and the poorest father in the world. I had everything money could buy, but I couldn't help my son. Then a 12-year-old boy with nothing taught me what real wealth looks like. It looks like compassion, understanding, the willingness to sit with someone in their pain and just be present." He put his hand on Wei's shoulder. Wei could have walked away. He could have decided our problems weren't his concern, but he chose kindness instead, and in doing so, he changed everything. So this foundation isn't charity, it's gratitude. It's a promise that no child should have to choose between saving their family and surviving, that no kid should have to feel invisible. The applause was thunderous. Way's face was bright red, but he managed a small smile. In the front row, Victoria held Samuel on her lap. The little boy was clapping too, even though he couldn't hear the sound. He could feel the vibration, see the joy on people's faces. That was enough. After the speeches, after the dinner, after all the handshakes and photographs, the Blake family went home together. 4 people who hadn't started as family but had become one anyway. Not because of blood, because of choice. That night, Richard tucked both boys into their beds. Samuel first, with the wooden bird Way had given him still on the nightstand. Then Way, who'd finally stopped treating his room like a temporary shelter and started filling it with personal things, photos, books, a half-finished model airplane. "Thank you," Richard said quietly, "for everything." Way sat up in bed. "I should thank you, Mr. Blake. You gave me a home. You gave us something more important. You gave us perspective. You reminded me that the best things in life can't be bought. They have to be built, person by person, moment by moment." "My grandmother used to say that people are like puzzles," Way said. "Sometimes the pieces you're missing aren't the ones you expect." Samuel needed someone who understood his silence. "You and Mrs. Blake needed to remember that love matters more than solutions. And He paused. "I needed to know that even when you lose everything, you can still find family. That you're not alone unless you choose to be." Richard sat on the edge of the bed. "You're not alone, Way, not anymore, not ever again." "I know," Way said softly. "That's the miracle, isn't it? Not what I did for Samuel, but what we all did for each other." 3 years later, Samuel started at a school for deaf children, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He'd asked to go using the sign language he'd mastered with Way's help. "I want to meet kids like me," he'd signed. "I want to show them they're not alone." Way was 15 now, taller, confident in ways he hadn't been when Richard first met him. He'd started a program at his school teaching kids to volunteer in their communities, to look for the invisible people and help them feel seen. 50 students had joined in the first month. Way led by example, still working at the restaurant, not because he had to anymore, but because he said the owner had given him a job when nobody else would, and loyalty mattered. The Way Foundation had grown beyond Richard's wildest expectations. They'd helped 300 families in the first year alone. Medical bills paid, scholarships provided, immigration lawyers hired, small interventions that changed entire lives. Richard had learned that the best investment he'd ever made wasn't in tech stocks or real estate. It was in people. Specifically in one poor boy who'd shown up at a hospital with nothing but compassion and a wooden bird and somehow changed everything. Victoria had found her purpose too. Her art classes had expanded into a full community centre in Way's old neighbourhood. She taught painting, drawing, sculpture. All the creative outlets she'd been taught were hobbies for rich people. Now she knew they were lifelines for anyone who needed to express what words couldn't capture. On Samuel's 8th birthday, the whole family gathered in their backyard. Friends from the deaf school, kids from Way's volunteer program, families the foundation had helped. It was loud and chaotic and perfect. Way and Samuel sat together under a tree, watching the celebration. Samuel had gotten so much bigger, so much braver. He still used sign language as his primary communication, but he'd learned to read lips too, and he spoke when he wanted to, his voice clear and strong. "Do you remember when we met?" Way signed to Samuel. Samuel nodded. "You were crying," he signed back. "I didn't understand why. Everyone else tried to make me stop crying, but you cried with me. That's when I knew I wasn't alone." "You were never alone," Way signed. "You just needed someone to speak your language. You saved me," Samuel signed. Way shook his head. "We saved each other. And that was the truth of it. Not a miracle, not a fairy tale. Just two boys who'd been lost in different kinds of silence, finding each other across the divide, teaching a family that love doesn't require perfect understanding, just the willingness to try, to sit in the pain, to hold on when everything feels impossible." Richard watched them from the porch, his arm around Victoria. "I used to think I had to fix everything," he said. "I used to believe money could solve any problem." "And now?" Victoria asked. "Now I know the most important things can't be bought. They have to be given freely. Way taught me that. Samuel taught me that. You taught me that." He smiled. "I'm the luckiest man alive. Not because of what I have, because of what I've learned to give." The party continued as the sun set, casting golden light over the gathered families. Samuel's laughter rose above the noise, not in spite of his deafness, but in harmony with it. Way's joy was quieter but no less real, the kind that comes from knowing you belong. And Richard stood there, the billionaire who'd been brought to his knees by his son's tears, now standing tall because he'd learned to kneel, to accept help, to understand that sometimes the answer to an impossible problem walks through the door, wearing a too-big jacket and carrying a wooden bird and a heart big enough to hold the world's pain. Samuel would grow up to be an advocate for deaf rights, using his voice and his signs to speak for those who felt unheard. Way would become a doctor, dedicating his life to serving immigrant communities, never forgetting where he came from. Victoria would run the foundation with fierce determination, expanding its reach across the country. And Richard would learn that the greatest legacy wasn't the company he built or the fortune he'd amassed. It was this: two boys who'd needed each other, finding exactly what they were looking for. A family built not on blood or money, but on the simple, revolutionary act of choosing to understand. Because in the end, that's what saved them all. Not wealth, not expertise, just one person saying to another, "I see you. I hear your silence. You're not alone." Sometimes the impossible is just that simple. And sometimes a poor boy with nothing can give a rich man everything that matters. Moral lessons of the story. True wealth is not measured in money or possessions, but in compassion, understanding, and human connection. Sometimes the people we least expect, those with nothing material to offer, carry the greatest wisdom and can solve problems that money cannot fix. Listening and being present with someone in their pain is often more powerful than trying to fix them or make the pain disappear. Children and those who have suffered deeply often understand loneliness and fear better than experts, because they have lived through it themselves. Real strength comes not from having all the answers, but from admitting when we need help and accepting it with humility and grace. Family is not always defined by blood, but by the choice to show up, to care, and to stay even when things are difficult. Kindness given freely, without expecting anything in return, has the power to transform lives in ways we cannot predict or control. The most meaningful solutions to human problems come from the heart, not from technology, science, or expensive interventions. When we open ourselves to learning from unlikely teachers, we discover that wisdom exists everywhere, especially in places we've been taught to overlook. Love, understanding, and genuine presence are the greatest gifts we can offer another human being, and they cost nothing but our willingness to truly see each other. Dear friends, what you just saw is only one part of the bigger picture. In the next video, I'll reveal the twist no one saw coming, so make sure you're here when it drops. I would love to know what you would have done in this situation. Drop your thoughts below. I'll be reading every single comment. Thank you so much for watching. I love you so much, and don't forget to give this video a like, hit the subscribe button, and share with someone who needs to hear it.
想写习一句唱歌是游戏，紧紧手抱的礼物，可惜也收到不幸你还没的陪。哦，你是个征服者，要专一要勇的明嘅宝贝。 今天是你好的你，真的好冷静，是眉目而来悬跳，有生灭彻底灭的记，在心里打透，让天也晒有惊喜，你还能一道给手，你是个征服者，要全力要勇的，要贴保庇。真情贴里好会牵，风之多忧伤，洗礼我而又闪电，我也是我，又凭你那晚，隔绝能搞透，听成夜，所以都听见了，何必能够泪，加油，余生也只眼上忧伤。